Yes, okay, so I'm going to introduce a topic today. Basically, I'm going to be introducing the Moravians. We'll talk more specifically about Rebecca and the Moravian missions in St. Thomas next week. Uh, One of my favorite parts of the course is talking about them. But to do that, I have to give a little background on Pietism, which preceded the Moravians. Does anybody know what Pietism is? Have you heard the term Pietism? Hey, how are you? Pardon? I didn't get you. I'm sorry. Say it one more time. Okay. Anybody else? Pietism?
Isn't it like something that isn't it like a one something and like for the sake of like the religion?
Lowering yourself?
Yeah, kind of like living the religion. Yeah.
I wouldn't say that. I saw your hand up too, Sophia. I mean, it could include that, but not necessarily. Okay. That's pretty close. That's accurate. Yes. No. Yes, no. You're partly correct because that would be a pejorative understanding of pietism, and it's kind of true nowadays of some pietistic people, but that's not the original meaning. Like that's like Puritans. Puritans have a certain definition, but today, if you say someone is a Puritan, it's usually a negative thing. The same thing with Pharisees. So pietism comes from the word piety, and it means a approach to religion or faith that is pious. And there's a specific movement in history that we'll talk about that was that's called pietism, and we could talk about Leonie. Your definition is something we could talk about in current or contemporary terms, because often with any kind of church movement, it mutates or it gravitates over decades and centuries into something maybe that was not intended at the beginning. So going back to pietism, I uh, I actually used um, oh man, this is not going to work very well, but let's try it. I'm trying to record this for my channel. So over here you see medieval Christendom, and that's the period of time in the medieval period when there was a some people call it a sacred canopy, where there's kind of a unified belief system, a unified political system, a unified religious system, kind of all in one encompassing sacred canopy. It's actually a little bit mythologized or reified because uh, the medieval Catholicism was never as unified and monolithic as people think. There was always splinter groups and groups that were called heretics and so on within Catholicism. But during the medieval period, there was this unified concept of Christianity that combined political power with religious power in Europe. And then came the Reformation in 1517. I go into all this in the course on Introduction to Christianity. The Reformation comes along and basically splits this down the middle in Europe. And there's a bunch of things involved politics and economics in addition. It's not just about religious issues, but that's a big part of it. And in the Reformation, you have out of that you have Roman Catholicism, mostly in the southern part of Europe, Spain, Italy, Portugal, southern Germany, Romania, other parts of Europe. The fault lines kind of ran to Germany and Belgium, where you had some parts that were very Catholic, some parts that were Protestant. Protestant comes from the idea of protesting. And so out of the Protestant Reformation, you get several groups. Luther, I don't have these in order. There's no order of appearance here. I just wrote them down as I followed them. Lutheranism, you might say, is the first one because Martin Luther nailed his theses, 95 theses, to the church door. That's the legendary story. I don't know if it actually happened or not. There's a great film, Joseph Pietist, that depicts this. when he's angry about the selling of indulgences and the manipulation of the poor in Germany, trying to give them promises of forgiveness if they that they can buy or pay for. And so they get by paying money, they can get less time in not hell, what's it called, purgatory. And so this grew out of the medieval Christian period, but there's some theological development in it, but as you study the history, it became to be abused in a particular period of time. Right around this time, 1500, the Pope was building St. Peter's St. Peter's Cathedral. He was in debt. He needed money, so he commissioned John Tetzel, a Dominican priest, to travel around Germany and put on these passion plays about eternal damnation and hell in order to motivate people to give money to buy indulgences. Luther found out about this and was deeply offended. He was a very passionate man about truth and justice. He also had his issues, had a bit of an anger problem. So, hang on, let me finish my story here. So, Lutheranism came out in 1517. It was the church, it represents the churches that were founded following Luther's ideas about the Reformation and about the scriptures. Also, you have Anglicanism, which came about because Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and the Pope wouldn't give it to him. And so he said, okay, I'm going to start my own denomination. I'm oversimplifying, but trying to get a little humor in it too. Calvinism, John Calvin came later. It never really was a specific church. The churches that follow Calvinism are called Reformed churches, but it's more of an ideological movement than it is a church system. And then the Anabaptists were the powerless who didn't have any princes or political authorities backing them up. They were pretty much defenseless. They got pretty much slaughtered and killed all over Europe. And so the Sermon on the Mount took on a particular meaning, deep meaningfulness to them, and they developed into the peace tradition of pacifism, anti-war. The Mennonites would be an example of Anabaptists. So Lutherans, Martin Luther came up. So the Catholic idea was that there's a combination of faith and works and grace that all work together to produce sanctification and bring about salvation. That it's a process. It's not an instantaneous magical event that you're suddenly forgiven for all your sins, but you need to take the sacraments, go to confession. You need to pray, read, not read the Bible necessarily, but pray and seek God and obey your priest, and you would grow in grace and in salvation. Then along comes Luther, who was tormented by fear of his own salvation, and he was fearful that he was going to be condemned to hell. He had a very sensitive conscience. He probably struggled with depression and some other things. And he, in studying Romans, he came across the passage that says, "The just shall live by faith," and this became the key verse to unlock the meaning of the scriptures to him. So he began to teach that salvation comes through faith by grace alone. And from this we get the terms sola fide and sola scriptura. And he also developed the idea that the only authority that we can look to, external authority besides our own conscience, is the scriptures. Not popes, not the priests, not the church, but scriptures. Which is interesting, and I'm sympathetic. I'm a Protestant, and I'm sympathetic with that idea, but it has some unfortunate developments. As with all ideas in human history, it has unintended consequences, which we'll talk about maybe later on in the course. So, faith through grace alone. This then takes us to Lutheranism. Had this idea. Now, this is in Germany and Sweden, Denmark, were mostly Lutheran countries. And these countries followed Luther's teaching, and they had the idea that salvation was only through faith. It had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with your actions. or your feelings. Now, in the first generation of Lutherans, this was a very liberating idea because suddenly I realized, okay, I'm kind of a rascal, and I've messed up and I've done some things that I'm not particularly proud of. So I'm not worthy of God or salvation. But according to Luther, it doesn't matter. If I believe that Christ died for me and rose from the dead, if I believe that, and more importantly, if I trust in that, which is a different shade of meaning than just belief, intellectual belief, I will be saved. And so the love of God for me is unconditional, and it's not based on, it's unconditional love. It's not based on my personal worth or my personal behavior. There's no karma. I can't do enough good deeds to ever balance the scales. My sin or human sin in general is so bad that no amount of good works is ever enough to balance the scales. And so on my own, I'm lost. But I'm not on my own because Christ died for me. And if I believe that and receive it in faith, then it means that I may feel like a turd. Where did I get that? I saw that. I've been hearing that somewhere. Sure. Oh, maybe it was, Last Kingdom with Uhtred of Devonburg. Anybody watch that? They use that term a little bit. It's like one of their bad customers.
So funny, but what is curse words are included the thing is very well curse word, the term, and the F word are pretty old.
And so, in the first generation, being freed from this sense of, and I'm not trying to be critical here, but I just want to say it to make the point of Catholic guilt. People joke about growing up in the Catholic school system that there's a sense of guilt, like maybe they've sinned or, they can never quite get away with that, or the nuns hit them with the rulers. Uh, Within Lutheranism, there's a liberation from that. Like, oh, I believe. So it doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter how much I've messed up. However, with every religious movement, you have to look at what happens with the second and the third generation. How does this play out? And I could talk about Calvinism. It's got a specific trajectory in the second, third, and fourth generations, which is pretty interesting, but that's not really our topic today. But in Lutheranism, it developed in Germany into kind of a cold religion, nominalism. You know what I mean by nominalism? When someone's a Catholic, but they might go to church on Easter, and that's it. And they go because their grandmother wants them to go. And so they're Catholic, it's part of their identity, but it's not really a daily discipline or daily. Now, there's lots of Catholics for whom it is a daily practice who are very devout in their faith and who do seek to become better people and grow in sanctification. Uh, but in every religion, there can be a tendency to nominalism, where your parents were religious, your parents were Lutherans, your grandparents were Lutherans, so you're a Lutheran, but it doesn't really change what you do day to day. You don't think about it much. It's not that important to you. Well, that's kind of an outcome of this belief that it has nothing to do with feelings, it has nothing to do with your actions. It's only that you believe. Okay, sure I believe. Okay, now what are we going to do today? And so that's what happens in Germany in the 1400s. Jacob Spencer comes along and he says, this is not right. We need to revitalize the Lutheran faith. He develops an idea of the ecclesiola and ecclesia, which is the little church within the big church. This is where cell groups come from, or home Bible studies, or back in the 80s, 90s, there was a big emphasis on cell churches. They're the largest church in the world in Seoul, Korea, had like 380,000 people attending, and the way they made it work was everybody belonged to a cell. So you might be going to a church that had 10 services on the weekend and had 380 or 400,000 people in attendance, where you could get lost in the crowd, but you also showed up on Tuesday night or Wednesday night to your cell church, your cell group, and that's where you got together with 8 or 10 people. You prayed and you cared for each other and you watched out for each other and you exhorted one another. And so that came from Philip Jakob Spener in the around the 1400s. And it was an idea that, okay, we're going to get together and study the Bible midweek with a small group of people. We're going to pray and we're going to experience the presence of God. Now, this brings up another issue of interiority. I have trouble pronouncing that word, so I have to say it slowly. Interiority. What do I mean when I say interiority?
Okay.
An interior emphasis, looking within. If you went back to the classical Greeks and Romans, there was no interiority. They weren't looking within, they were looking above. There was no concept of, there was no real concept of in-depth psychology or the unconscious mind. This comes later with the modern age, but it begins with this pietism where now what's important is not only that I go to church and that I believe, but it's also important that I feel something. I need to feel the presence of God. I need to seek to have this inner disposition. This actually goes back to St. Augustine, St. Augustine, depending on which pronunciation. I don't like Augustine, but everybody says it that way, so I'll go along with the crowd. They should take the E off the end of his name if it's going to be St. Augustine. But St. Augustine, in his Confessions, was one of the first writers. This is after the classical period, as you're transitioning away from the Roman Empire into the medieval period. St. Augustine wrote Confessions in which he did a lot of introspection into his soul. And one of the things, I believe he said it, or it's one of the church fathers not too long after him, said that the journey to God is the journey to the center of my soul. Or maybe they said it backwards, or the other way. The journey to into my soul is the journey to God. In other words, to get to know God, you had to also get to know yourself, because God lives in me. Because God lives in me, I to get to God, I have to go within as well as up or without. And this is interiority. There wasn't a lot of that in the Protestant Reformation. It was more about intellectual propositions. Christ died, he rose again. He died for my sins. If I trust in that, if I believe, now, if you say I believe, that's more less interior. But if you say I trust, the trust word is more interior, isn't it? Because it's not just an intellectual belief. Trust implies an emotional disposition. I might believe in. I could almost see your name. I'm sorry. What's your name? Angie. I saw an A. I started to say Abigail. I might believe in Angie, but do I trust Angie? Those are two different questions. I might believe in that chair, but if I'm going to get up and stand on it, I have to trust that it'll hold me up. You know what I'm saying? So this idea of trust is a further step. You might even say it's somewhat pietistic. And so this pietism movement was a reform movement. But oftentimes, reform movements in 2 or 3 generations have very different outcomes than what the initiators of the movement expected or hoped for. And so pietism develops, and then it's persecuted in Czechoslovakia in the 1400s. John Huss is killed, burned at the stake. Along comes Luther, the Reformation, and then and I think I have that information in my notes over here, which I have up here. Um, so Pietism developed after the 30 Years' War in Germany. Then along come the Moravians, who were pietistic, and they started around 1415. They created a community called the Unity of the Brethren, Hednota Bratska, 1457. They were kind of persecuted nearly out of existence, but then a count, a German count in Saxony, who had a large estate, uh, he himself was a pietist, Count Zinzendorf, and so he invited these uh, Church of the Brethren, scattered Church of the Brethren people who were being persecuted to come to his estate where they would be sheltered and protected. They named the estate Herrnhut, which I don't remember right now, but I think it means something like House of Prayer, or it has some spiritual significance. And he became the leader. Count Zinzendorf became the leader of the Moravians. And the Moravians were pietistic. I'm going to talk more about them next week. They were a sectarian Reformation movement. They were a sect. They were pietistic, so they hyper spiritualized almost everything. And this is where Leone, not so much with them, but with later generations of pietistic groups, you start getting like the group I grew up in was the Holiness Church, and you women had to wear long dresses down to their ankles and their hair braided in back and no makeup, and you couldn't drink a beer, you couldn't go dancing, you couldn't play cards. So there becomes a very legalistic emphasis on external behavior. And then there's a human tendency. It's one thing when you're doing those things because you want to experience God. It's another thing when you're doing those things out of social pressure and you notice someone who's not doing them and you think, well, they're not as spiritual as me. That's where the problem comes with religious or spiritual pride. And what started out as a beautiful attempt to bring feeling and ethical behavior back to Lutheran doctrine or Christian living becomes sort of illegal, kind of a legalism, like the Pharisees who crossed over the road and wouldn't help the man who was beaten up beside the road, or the Pharisees who turned their noses up at the woman, the woman who came in and washed Jesus' feet because they knew she was a sinful woman. That's where those things kind of, like the manna in the desert in Exodus, it begins to stink after a day or two. It was good the first day, but then it kind of gets corrupted. Any questions so far? This is pietism. Now, the reason why I'm going over this is pietism leads to the Moravians. The Moravians are huge in the Caribbean. They still are today. The Moravians came along after the Quakers. They had some similar things to the Quakers. One of their similarities were they were strictly egalitarian. They gave opportunities for women in primary leadership, top levels of leadership. They gave opportunities for people of color, for Afro descendants, for blacks to be in top levels of leadership, and they intermarried whites and blacks. Rebecca herself married one of the German missionaries, and eventually was invited to go back to Germany and was a significant leader in the Moravian movement in Germany. Rebecca, which we're going to talk about next week, I think. Her story. I'm sorry. Well, I'll be here talking about it. Just working really hard. No, I'm kidding. We'll talk about it in 2 weeks. Thank you for reminding me. I'm looking forward to spring break. How many of you are looking forward to it? Yeah. What are you going to do for spring break? You're going to go. I thought about going to the Keys. Or I might drive 2 hours west and go wading in the Gulf of Mexico. I might even do a little bit of snorkeling and look down in the water and saying, where are those Gulf of Mexico fish? Anyway, I'm just kidding around. So the reason why I'm going over this is I talked to you, I think, last week about evangelicalism, and evangelical movement is sometimes hard to categorize. It's very diverse, and I think the Republican Party has been identified as evangelical because a large percentage of evangelicals have voted since Reagan, actually, for the Republican Party. However, it's very diverse, and there are very progressive groups within the evangelical movement as well. And I can talk about those at a later point. They're just less numerous or maybe less visible than the more dominant parts of the evangelical movement. But you can't really understand contemporary Christianity without some awareness of what evangelicalism is, and then out of that, Pentecostalism, which is not entirely evangelical. It has a lot of overlap, but it's different, and we'll get to that by the end of the semester. Um, so the Moravians believed in spiritual equality for all, including women and African Americans. They were very open to intermarriage between uh, Africans, slave descendants, mulattoes, and white Europeans. They were very open to women in high positions of leadership. So they have a lot to commend them. They also were a little weird. And I'm not quite, I don't have my notes with me here today, but there's one part of the book, Rebecca, where there's a chapter that talks about some of their child rearing practices in Germany, some of their ideas about marriage and sexuality, and it's like, okay, this seemed a little cult-like. And I mean, it was not. It was just a little obsessive. And they would take the children from the parents and raise them in group homes instead of the parents raising their children. They'd be raised by the community. Interesting idea. They had to get permission to get married, and they were sometimes encouraged to get married. They would kind of pick out their partner and encourage them strongly. And so we'll talk about that. And it's often the case that sects or sectarian movements develop some strange characteristics because they're very highly committed. They're somewhat insular. They're separated from the larger society and the larger body of Christianity, and they're highly focused on certain aspects of reform or social change, theological change, and because of that, they can also develop some strange characteristics. And again, like I said, I'll come back and talk about that next week. The Moravians did have a foundational influence on the Methodists, which we'll also be getting to I said next week. I'm sorry, Amelia. I meant in 2 weeks. Uh, in about 3 or 4 weeks, we'll be talking about the Methodists. I actually have less material on them. I haven't found any really good books on Methodists in the Caribbean. There are some books about, but they're kind of tend to be kind of dry, where a Methodist wrote kind of a blow by blow history. Then so and so came, and then they started these churches, and then they did this, and their congregations agree to that. But there's no really compelling stories, so it's a little harder for me to bring Methodist material into this course. I hope to correct that in the future. But John Wesley, do you know the story of John Wesley? Have you heard his name? I'm named after him, by the way. My name is Joseph Wesley Holbrook. My uncle was Joseph. He died in a motorcycle wreck when he was 16. So my father was John Wesley Holbrook. So he was named after John Wesley. They gave me half of that name and half of my uncle's name. And I named my son John Wesley Holbrook II. He's in Ohio. But you can tell when someone's from a Methodist family if one of the children is named John Wesley. And that was the case with my grandparents. So John Wesley, maybe I won't go into detail into his story, but I'll just tell one little vignette. He was from a group at Cambridge that was a group of young men who were highly devout. They were Anglicans. They were highly devout. They were serious about their faith, and they would rise at 4 o'clock in the morning. There were three of them: John and his brother Charles, and their friend Whitfield. What was his first name? Charles Whitfield? And Charles Wesley. So I guess they had the same first name. Charles Wesley was his younger brother. He was a songwriter. And George Whitfield turned out, eventually became an amazing open air preacher that traveled through the colonies. Benjamin Franklin went to hear him in Philadelphia and paced off the area and calculated there were 30,000 people listening to him. No amplification, no electric, just using a natural uh, I don't want to say harmonics. What do you want to say with sound?
Audio,
Huh?
audio.
Yeah, that's close. The sound dynamics of kind of a depressed area, depressed as in a bowl, and people up on the hillside, and he could speak, and 30,000 people could hear his voice. I don't know how he did it. I mean, I could lose my voice after teaching 2 classes here at FIU.
Basically, the Stonehenge apparently the one in Rome, they actually have natural acoustics.
That's the word is acoustics. Thank you. So yeah, it was like a natural amphitheater that
Actually,
they had. So he traveled all up and down the East Coast of the colonies and around the few years before, 20 years before the American Revolution, preaching the Methodist gospel. And this was part of what's called the First Great Awakening, out of which come the Methodist movement. But here's the story. John Wesley went to Georgia, the state in the South that at that time was just a new colony. And I think it was even by law slave free. This is before it was a slave state, I think. I could be wrong. but he went there with the intention of being a missionary to the indigenous people. And while he was there, he fell in love with this young woman who already had a fiance and ended up in this unfortunate love triangle that didn't turn out well for him. And so he ended up leaving Georgia depressed, angry with himself, and frustrated, and feeling like he'd disappointed his friends and family and God. And he was on a ship on his way back to England in disgrace, having been a failure as a missionary. And a big storm blew up, and there was some fear on the ship that the ship might sink. He was terrified. This is the story he tells in his journal. And on that ship was a small group of Moravian missionaries returning from the Caribbean. And they were in a group on the deck singing songs and praying and looking quite victorious, looking quite energized, smiling and praising God and not fearful at all. And he looked at them. Here's this guy. He was called a Methodist. It was a mocking term because he and his brother Charles and their friend George would get up at 4 a.m., read the Bible, memorize scripture, pray. They had this whole regimen that they developed for their spiritual discipline. And yet he was terrified, and he had just had this, got himself in this mess in Georgia. And here was this other group of Christians that looked peaceful and not at all disturbed by, and he was like, oh my God, who are these people? And he met them, found out who they were. They were Moravian missionaries. So when he got back to London, he went to one of their services at a place called Aldersgate. And in his journal that night, he wrote that his heart was strangely warmed by something he heard in that service about salvation through faith. And that's a lot of evangelicals mark that as his conversion moment. I mean, he was doing religious things. He was highly committed to Christ, but he had this inward fear and the lack of assurance, and it was the Moravians that inspired him to come to a place of peace about his own relationship with God. So this is John Wesley and the Methodist movement, I think, might be considered the first evangelical movement or the first wave of the evangelical movement in the First Great Awakening. Although I think you could probably consider the Moravians to be evangelical as well, but the evangelicalism kind of developed out of the Moravians. Questions? Okay, that's my little piece for today. Um, and so this introduces the topic of Moravians, Methodists, Baptists, who are a whole different animal. It's going to be fun talking about the Baptists. I'm curious about Baptists because uh, almost every slave uprising in the Caribbean and in the United States, and at least one I found in Africa, was led by Baptists, preachers. So I'm trying to figure out, maybe it's that term fighting fundies. I don't know. But the Baptists, they're just not having it. When I say Baptists, I mean Baptists who were either slaves or descendants of slaves or people of color. They had leadership, and they weren't pacifists. They weren't like the Anabaptists. They were willing to, and they were provoked. They had reasons to fight. And we'll be talking about them, especially in Jamaica. Okay, so one of my favorite students is here. Emily, you want to introduce yourself? You didn't expect to be called out, did you?
No.
I'm sorry. Emily is here, Rosario. She's getting ready to graduate, and she was in a couple of our classes in the certificate in Christian Studies, and she's in history. Nice to have you join us. I'm sorry. I put you on the spot. Okay, anybody else have anything you want to talk about today?